Professor Alexander Schnell is a professor from Belgische Universität Wuppertal in Germany. He used to teach in Université Poitiers and the Université Paris-Sorbonne Paris-4 in France. From September of 2016, he becomes a professor in Wuppertal, and he's responsible for theoretical philosophy and phenomenology in that university. And in the same university, he's now also directing the Institute for Transcendental Philosophy and Phenomenology. At the same time, he is also directing 3 centers, International Fichte Research Center, Open Think Center, Wuppertal, and Markt-Geschichte Archive. So this is a 3 center which he is directing right now in the University of Wuppertal. And he, at the same time, also served in lots of academic, very famous international academic institute. For instance, he is now the president of Association Internationale de Phenomenologie. He's also the editor of the Annales de Phenomenologie in France. I think he has a lot of, academic services on the international level. And he's specialized in metaphysics, ontology, the transcendental philosophy, the philosophical anthropology, and aesthetics. In recent years, he published actually a lot. In the past years, he published, for instance, Le Clignotement de l'être, 2021, Die phänomenologische Metaphysik, Markt-Geschichte, 2020. What is the Phenomenology 2019, and many, many others. He also published a lot of international journals, and also he edited 15 Sammelband, the collection books. This afternoon, he's gonna present a very interesting and very challenging phenomenological topic, namely on beneath appearing. Please join me to welcome Professor Alexander Schnell.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the very kind presentation, and thanks a lot for the invitation to talk in this seminar. Okay, let us start with the following 2 propositions of Husserl. Wer rettet uns vor einer Realisierung des Bewusstseins? Der wäre der Retter der Philosophie, ja, der Schöpfer der Philosophie. Who saves us from realization of the consciousness? This one would be the savior, even the creator of philosophy. These 2 sentences can be found in manuscript A136 from 1920. It must be emphasized that the Realisierung in question here is not a reification, as this term is usually translated, but indeed a realization. For there are entities that are not things, but that nevertheless fall under the regime of the real, for instance, functions, structures, etc. However, consciousness is in no way real. The main objective of the present contribution is to draw radical consequences from this. Among the different possibilities of identifying phenomenology and its idea, there are obviously 2 that in recent times stand out and predominate: realist phenomenology and still and again transcendental phenomenology. Knowing that noticeably, the first one has currently taken over the second one. What distinguishes these 2 orientations? As we know, both start from the point of view that the phenomenological analysis must be oriented in relation to an object, and that it is of this object that it is a question of bringing to light the modes of constitution. But whereas realist phenomenology, in its most general form, considers the object as the exclusive threat of its approaches and sets up this object, insofar as it is considered as pre-given, as the only scale of the phenomenological analyses, transcendental phenomenology does not question only the objective donation, but extends the phenomenological interrogation in the direction of the phenomenality of the phenomena. And this can lead, if necessary, to the disconnection of phenomenality and objectivity. The phenomenon will then be considered as pure phenomena. Examples for this are the Husserlian time objects, Zeitobjekte, the pure appearing as appearing in Fink, or the phenomena as nothing but phenomena in Richer. But there may be other criteria to separate realist and transcendental phenomenology. For instance, perhaps the fact of turning towards phenomenology of singular experience on the one hand, or towards transcendental and universal Wesensstrukturen, structures of eidos on the other. Through my own work, I am following the second direction, that of a transcendental phenomenology. Not so much because of any reserve towards realism, and even then I will come back to it in conclusion, but because the attachment to the origins and to the beginnings, always to be renewed, of phenomenology justify this fidelity to the transcendental. Now, for decades, the idea of transcendental phenomenology has become considerably more complex. Today, I would like to take stock of this and to show why and in what way the elaboration of a transcendental phenomenology cannot be disconnected from a descent into the beneath appearing. I thus come back, certainly in another way, since I will always have in view the said phenomenality of the phenomenon, I thus come back to the question of the link in phenomenology between the apparent and the inapparent. This descent into the beneath appearing will be carried out in three different ways. The entry in this problematic will be initiated from what one could call the internal border of the phenomenal field, thus the subjective border, so to speak, or the immanent border, or from what I called myself in my first works on Husserl, the pre-immanent sphere of the phenomenological field. The phenomenological field is more complex than it seems. Classically, it is understood from the Husserlian affirmation according to which, with epoche and reduction, a new world opens up, the world of Sinnbildung, of sense formation. These methodological tools of epoche and reduction allow, by using the thread of constituted objectivities, to bring to light the constitutive structures or processes of these objectivities. According to Husserl, this concerns the different types of intentionality which correspond to the types of objects previously highlighted by the phenomenologists. These intentionalities are not visible or are not conscious in the natural attitude. To bring them to light requires a change of gaze. What lets it be established is always under the reign of an intuitive evidence. And the whole of these structures or processes constitutes precisely this new world indicated at the moment. These are obviously very well known things. However, it happens that there are phenomenological problems which are not soluble at the level of the immanent sphere. The most well-known example concerns the phenomenology of time, and more particularly the constitution of the immanent temporality itself. If the temporality of the appearing objects, certainly bracketed by epoche, is constituted by the subjective modes of the retentional and protensional intentionality, what about the temporality of these modes themselves? Is it in turn constituted by more buried subjective modes? Or does it require a constitution in objective temporality? In the first case, the same question would arise again with respect to the temporality of these new modes. Does it in turn require such a subjective constitution? And we would risk falling into an infinite regression. In the second case, we would fall into a petition of principle, because what we were trying to account for from the start were precisely the objective modes of temporality. Husserl envisages a perspective to solve this problem by opening the sphere of what he calls a pre-phenomenal or pre-immanent temporality. This notion of a pre-phenomenality or pre-immanence was already introduced in 1907 in Ding und Raum. But the phenomenology of time and space is not the only case of the pre-phenomenality or the pre-immanence in phenomenology. We can refer, for example, to the phenomenology of the intersubjectivity, of the original Hülle, Urhülle, etc. But what exactly is found in this pre-immanent sphere? Husserl's texts, even his manuscripts, do not inform us about this. And we notice in a more general way that the phenomenological literature has practically never examined this problematic. The reason for this is that it is an operative approach in the sense that Fink could speak of operative concepts. In my own elaborations of a constructive or generative phenomenology, a real dive into pre-immanence, so to say, I try to contribute to fill this gap. To be able to say what one finds in the pre-immanent sphere, it would be necessary, first of all, to make considerations of a methodological order. In Wirklichkeitsbilder and Seinsschwingungen, and the same books are Le Sens Suffisant et Le Clignotement de l'Être in French, I have developed at length which extensions are necessary on the level of the method to give an account of what is here at stake. This concerns in particular the tools of the phenomenological construction beneath the description of the hypophysical epoche. It's a kind of epoche in the epoche at the preeminent sphere, and of the phenomenological induction, which leads into the preeminent. These are the counterparts, thus belonging to the preeminent sphere of the phenomenological description of the epoche and of the reduction to the level of the immanent sphere, on which I cannot come back here. I thus refer to these two words. Then I want to specify what is presented here expresses a very firm position with regard to the necessity for phenomenology to take seriously theoretical stakes, touching on what classically has been called stakes pertaining to knowledge. We shall see in which sense I understand this term. Recently, there has been talk of all sorts of turning points in phenomenology. I have the impression that these turns have in fact the essential objective of turning away from the initial theoretical stakes of phenomenology. I would like to make another voice heard, one that engages in a rehabilitation of the question of knowledge in phenomenology, taking into account, of course, the criticisms of Husserlian epistemology, which requires, such as one of these of the thesis defended here, with which I distance myself from the mainstream to take into account speculative elements. So I come back to my question. What is found in the preeminent sphere? If we consider this question from a strictly theoretical point of view, we can detect three fundamental operative steps, I would say, three synthetic operations or syntheses to which correspond three kinds of phenomenological constructions. Since the first deduction of categories in the critique of pure reason, the idea that there are three syntheses has had an important future in transcendental philosophy. I will only mention the three syntheses of the understanding of the A deduction in Kant, the three passive syntheses of time in Deleuze's difference and repetition, or the passive syntheses of the first, second, and third degree in Richier's phenomenological meditations. The first type of synthesis is a post factum synthesis. The second is a radical synthesis aiming at an ultimate unity. And the third is a genetic synthesis. To be a little more precise, the first synthesis always seeks, for example, in Husserl or Merleau-Ponty, a foundation for an antithetical opposition, but in the manner of a perfectly assumed post factum synthesis. For example, a synthetic term of the opposition between objective temporality and subjective temporality, or for that between the egological dimension and the intersubjective dimension of transcendental subjectivity. The second synthesis moves radically towards a unitary principle. For example, the self-affective life in Michel Henry, or the phenomenological sublime in Richier, which bears different names in him, but always aims at the same principle. And the third synthesis rejects the idea of a post factum synthesis and elaborates, by means of a generative synthesis, a quasi-dialectical conception of the legitimation of knowledge, or of the transcendental making comprehensible, transzendentales verständlich machen, to use Husserl's terms in The Crisis. Such a conception has not been developed in the history of phenomenology, not yet. It constitutes another attempt to contribute to the elucidation of phenomenology understood as transcendental idealism. Before developing further what is at stake here, I will not now move on to the second way of accessing the beneath appearing. The second way is the one through the transcendental logic. What is transcendental logic? It aims at two things. It seeks to establish the validity of a possible a priori relation to the object. And it aims at the self-foundation of knowledge. In what sense should we understand knowledge here? This brings us back to the question of the theoretical stakes that I put forward just now. It is not a question of a classical epistemological perspective, but of a type of understanding or comprehension that makes understanding and comprehension self-transparent. It is by taking knowledge in this sense that philosophy reveals itself in its eminent sense. This is not expressed in this way in Kant, who were the first to found transcendental logic. On the other hand, it is the idea governing Fichte's project, and in another sense, also Husserl's. And it is indeed Kant, Fichte, and Husserl who conceived the three fundamental and decisive programs of a transcendental logic. According to Kant, transcendental logic deals with the relation of thought to the object insofar as this relation is thought in a pure way by means of categories and their deduction. And that this relation is governed by the principles of pure understanding. For Fichte, the purpose of transcendental logic is to generate what for Kant is a given, namely the factum of the faculties of knowledge, sensibility and understanding, and the supreme point that is transcendental, a perception. Its starting point is thus knowledge, in the sense indicated just now, as coincidence and inseparability of thought and intuition. The transcendental logic concept through which Fichte unfolds the structure of knowledge is the concept of image. The image represents the content of knowledge, and it is self-reflective. It makes itself evident to itself. Fichte also calls it appearance, Erscheinung. The task of transcendental logic is thus the genetic construction of appearance as the genetic construction of the reflexive and self-evident structure of knowledge. Transcendental logic, as the place of a pure genesis of knowledge, deduces in Fichte the imaginal form of the content of this knowledge. And this content itself will be later be the object of the theory of science. As for Husserl, he does not defend the idea of a separation between form and content of knowledge, dissociating, as it is the case with Fichte, the transcendental logic from the doctrine of science itself. In order to be able to specify how this is presented more precisely in Husserl's case, let me recall his distinction between the different eidetic sciences, eidetische Wissenschaft. Husserl distinguishes between the formal eidetic science and the material eidetic science. The first one is the formal logic, which is divided in its turn into a formal apophantic, that's the doctrine of the forms of judgment, and a formal ontology. This is the doctrine of the forms of objects in general. It is the material eidetic science which corresponds to the transcendental logic. It studied the pure consciousness, which, taken in its radicality, is at the origin of the content or the matter of the objects, and not of the forms, which once again belong to the formal logic. The central methodological concepts of Husserlian transcendental logic are those of intuitive evidence and description. His transcendental logic, as a descriptive phenomenology, deals then with the relation to the object understood in its eidetic material dimension. Now, the thesis defended here is that this way of situating transcendental logic in phenomenology entirely on the side of the eidetic material does not take into account the fact that there are aspects pertaining to the said genesis of the reflexive structure of knowledge, which are neither purely formal and thus do not belong to formal logic, nor material in Husserl's sense. Husserl has left a free space in the transcendental logic, where one would expect the legitimization of the relation to the object, and of all that is established in the material part. The genesis of the reflexive structure of knowledge must be integrated into the phenomenological field. It must be made a phenomenological phenomenon within the transcendental logic itself. And the three syntheses or synthetic operations mentioned above constitute precisely the object of this new part of phenomenological transcendental logic, which I would call a generative transcendental logic. The aim here is not only to highlight a gap in the architectonics of the Husserlian eidetic sciences, but also to elaborate a device to fill this gap. We will see this a little bit later. I finally come to the third possible way of access to the beneath appearing. Following Husserl, Laszlo Tengeli has developed the concept of a metaphysics of the original facts, Urtatsachen, which is supported by a methodological transcendentalism. These original or primordial facts are, first of all, the I, ich, the world, the intersubjectivity, and history, or the historical teleology. If these facts take the place of the I, the world, and God, inherited from the classical Metaphysica Specialis, Tengeli also proceeds to a transformation of the Metaphysica Generalis, insofar as a fifth fact, namely the fact of appearing itself, is taken into account in this development. Following Fink and Richier, appearing as appearing thus also becomes, in Tengeli, a basic concept of phenomenology, insofar as it's in line with traditional metaphysics. However, it should be stressed that what is at stake here is what Tengeli has called the structures of facticity, characteristic of the immanent sphere. The question then arises whether there is a counterpart or a parallel of these structures at the level of the pre-immanent sphere. Can we speak of structures of transcendentality there? Another thesis of my contribution will consist in making us see, and this constitutes precisely this third possible way of access to the beneath appearing, that there are two kinds of pre-phenomenal structures or transcendental structures, precisely, which present themselves at this level. The three syntheses introduced above, and also three fundamental concepts, which are correlation, sense, Sinn, and reflection. For this point, to which I will return, I refer to paragraph 48 of the crisis concerning correlation, and to paragraph 55 of the Ideen 1 concerning Sinn, sense, and paragraph 77 of the Ideen 1 concerning reflection. And I also refer to a quotation from Walter Bieme, who a disciple of Husserl's, who was the first to draw attention to the same point. I quote, that something is understood when psychic acts are grasped in reflection as intentional, which acts are indispensable for the origin of sense, is a fundamental idea of phenomenology. We have just seen that the speculative dimension in this consideration of the beneath appearing is reached by the descent in the preeminent or pre-phenomenal sphere, and by a consideration of a non-material transcendental logic in phenomenology. This one puts effectively in evidence and develops the structures of transcendentality. How to proceed from there? The beginning of an answer to this question will be the object of my second part now. We are here in a situation close to that of Kant. The transcendental was mobilized in him to solve ad hoc problems. For example, what makes it possible to account for the fact that we can be affected by something? What makes possible the synthesis of diverse in an object? What makes it possible to unify or relate to each other intuitions and concepts, which are heterogeneous representations? Or how can we formulate the principles which command the a priori relation between our representations and the objects, etc.? It is the same thing with Husserl's preimmanence or pre-phenomenality. It is mobilized only in precise and each time quite different cases. Now, as we can show quite easily, what commands the passage from the Kantian transcendental to the Fichtean and Husserlian transcendental, at least at the level of the immanent sphere, is the necessity to make the transcendental intuitive. But this way is not possible because the passage to the preimmanence consists very precisely in going beneath the sphere of the intuition or the evidence. What we have here, as we have seen, are the structures of transcendentality. What allows us to go further in the self-reflexive processuality of these structures? Fink already said in this respect, in the sixth Cartesian meditation, the phenomenalization in its deepest layers does not constitute a human attitude, but, I quote, a transcendental happening as a happening of the transcendental self-movement of the constitutive life. Happening translates geschehen. We reach here, so to speak, the limits of the transcendental. Let us now see what self-reflexive processes are carried out from here. It is nothing other than the elaboration of a generative matrix of Sinnbildung from the three fundamental concepts of correlation, sense, and reflection. This matrix already appears in various forms in the phenomenological literature. I simply refer to what Heidegger named in the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, the Grundgeschehen, fundamental happening of his metaphysics of the world, or to what Richir called in the first volume of Phénomène Temps et Être, the transcendental matrix of his own refoundation of transcendental phenomenology. Now, here, the generative matrix of Sinnbildung corresponds to the third synthesis presented above. We could show that it is a synthesis of the first two, a synthesis of syntheses at the heart of a generative or constructive phenomenology. I will briefly explain what the approach is. The idea is that there are three fundamental concepts of phenomenology, as I said, correlation, sense, and reflection, introduced by Husserl, but that he did not reflect either for themselves or with respect to their interrelation. The object here is to make of this interrelation a properly phenomenological phenomenon which will fill the gap of the non-material part of the phenomenological transcendental logic. But once again, and such is the specificity emerging from the previous considerations on preimmanence, this takes place in a self-reflexive processuality. This is concretized in what I call the generative matrix of Sinnbildung. I specify once again the three elements or motives. The first fundamental motive in the elaboration of such a generative matrix consists in making the transcendental phenomenological correlation itself the theme of the reflection. What is the phenomenological correlation? From this question follows the second motive, which is to establish once and for all as a phenomenological phenomenon the principle not of knowledge, but of the making comprehensible of phenomenological knowledge, and thus the essence of Sinnbild. Finally, and this will be the third motive, it will be a question of clarifying the nature of the phenomenological reflection itself. Correlativity or correlation, significativity, sense, and reflexivity, reflection. These are the three fundamental concepts that cross in their co-appurtenance and in their mutual relations the generative matrix of Sinnbild. The following project develops thus according to the content of the specific Sachhaltigkeit or reality of a phenomenality that encompasses the sensible and reflexive structure of the phenomenological correlativity, the significativity, and the reflexivity, whose interrelation appears as an outstanding phenomenological phenomenon. Let us therefore develop the content of these three concepts. The first one is the phenomenological correlation. What underlies it is, as we know, intentionality. If intentionality is not simply a doubling of the given in a modality of consciousness, nor the fact that something given is actually conscious, and if it is a question of explaining afterwards how the Sinnbildung, that is the constitutive configuration of the sense of the appearing, is possible, then it is necessary to bring to light the fundamental characteristic, assuring each time the relation to the object. Such a fundamental property can be called, referring to the Heideggerian deepening of the Husserlian concept of intentionality, which places this elaboration at a level beneath the separation of the epistemological and the ontological, a pre-Caesar, also Vorgriff, opening the horizontality. The phenomenological correlation never designates a simply static or mechanical relation. It rather expresses the idea that any donation of something is inscribed in the horizontal framework or comprehensibility. This one is not necessarily transparent, far from it. It can be unconscious or not actually conscious in any other way. What matters only is that one opposes to the being in itself a perspective that reveals that being as open to consciousness, to being conscious. Now, what is horizontally precise in the correlation? As Fink has rightly pointed out, the procedure is always a procedure of the appearance of sense, Sinnerscheinung, and of the order of sense, Sinnordnung. The sense designates in each case the significance as sense of something appearing. The appearing always appears as something, als etwas, and this constitutes the sense. This is, so to speak, the other side of the coin of the fact that the something is inscribed in the correlation. The object is not understood in its empirical existence, but as sense. As for the modality of the specifically phenomenological reflection, which is always at the same time a self-reflection, it supposes the transcendental induction, designating the specific performativity of the properly phenomenological form of reflection. The phenomenological self-reflection of these three concepts, revealing their interrelation, is accomplished in 3 times or at 3 levels. I do not have time today to proceed to the complete deployment of this self-reflexive processuality at 3 levels of correlation, sense, and reflection, as well as of their interrelation. I refer for that to my book Seinschwingung, or Le Clignotement de l'Être. I will make only a brief summary of it, which is the following. The correlation is underpinned by the intentionality that projects or is projected into the subject-object relation. If the latter, as the original split of consciousness, is seized as consciousness of consciousness, then self-consciousness emerges. Consciousness presupposes self-consciousness. But if the latter is self-reflective in its turn, it turns out to be underpinned by a pre-phenomenal and pre-subjective field, namely the pre-immanent or pre-phenomenal sphere we have already discussed. The sense is projected into another duality, that of the projected sense and the sense that is given, because the project of the sense responds each time to a donation of the sense at the level of which the adequacy of this project can be verified in a progressive way and through constantly renewed corrections. When this duality is self-reflective, it appears that the scale of truth is each time displaced and cannot be applied in a definitive way. In other words, we encounter here a kind of hermeneutic truth, which does not lead to ultimate truth, but which draws the consequences of the hermeneutic idea according to which truth is only the accomplishment of a truth always to be realized anew. And the interiorizing self-reflection of this hermeneutic truth does not constitute a new project of sense or a new interpretation that could be surpassed in other projects or interpretations, but it returns to the concept of a phenomenological generative construction. It is about a construction in the open of the pre-phenomenal sphere that reveals its adequacy and its necessary legality only in the construction itself. And it can be either a post factum synthesis or a synthesis aiming at a radical unity. To this sphere of phenomenological and generative constructivity corresponds the concept of generativity or generative truth, properly speaking. Finally, the meaning of the reflection is revealed through the clarification of the principle of transcendental making comprehensibility, which has also already been discussed. This one is projected in the duality between a simple concept, this principle, and this principle itself. The self-reflection of this duality makes it appear that this simple concept cannot be the original source of the elucidation of the principle of transcendental making comprehensible, but that it is precisely the concept that is opposed to it. The latter conceives itself in this self-reflection as a simple concept. And in order to be able to reach the source, this concept must in some way, precisely insofar as it is only such a concept, be annihilated. So a simultaneous project and annihilation emerges. This one can be named plasticity. More exactly, reflexive plasticity, because this term expresses precisely this double meaning of a projecting annihilation or of an annihilating projection. The interiorizing self-reflection of the reflexive plasticity, finally, is not only conceived as reflecting, but as opening the reflection in its reflexive legality. Thus, by revealing the laws of the reflection themselves pertaining to the knowledge and its legitimation. This consists in the possibilizing. That is to say, in a specific redoubling, which originally determines the transcendental and which makes transparent in a reflexive way the making possible as the making possible of the making possible in self. In the present case, the plasticity of which the self-reflection precisely makes appear the possibilizing. This legality of reflection expresses, moreover, with the possibilizing of understanding, a possibilization of being that is directly related to it. Why should we put forward this possibilization of the being? And above all, why does it appear through the possibilization of understanding? The first one, because if the possibilization of understanding were purely reflexive, and if it rested exclusively on an epistemological basis, then its character of possibilization would remain abstract and would amount to a simple affirmation. The last one, because the possibilization is situated beneath the split between the theory of knowledge and ontology, and that it makes it possible in the first place. The possibilizing redoubling thus gives rise to a higher order of plasticity that we could call a reflexible plasticity, beyond the reflexive plasticity that was situated at the second level of reflection. This reflexible plasticity is indeed, in its turn, a productive and engendering annihilation. Annihilation of all experimentable positivity of a conditioner and engendering of this conditioner itself, giving itself as ontological excess, which delivered the foundation there again, ontologically, to what is engendered by this, namely to the sought-after foundation of the elucidation of comprehension as well as inseparably to the reality of all appearing. To conclude, I will first bring together, once again, the main theses that have emerged in the foregoing. I have tried to show in the specification of the essence and the nature of the phenomenological field that it is necessary to take into account the pre-phenomenal or pre-immanent dimension of this field. This dimension or this pre-phenomenal sphere is not empty, but it makes appear structures of transcendentality, namely 3 types of synthesis and 3 fundamental concepts of phenomenology. The next step consisted in the highlighting of these fundamental concepts of phenomenology as they are articulated in a generative matrix of Sinnbild. The deployment of these concepts within this matrix was to assume a self-reflexive processuality. And this gives rise to 2 fundamental results. On the one hand, it fills a gap in the architectonics of transcendental phenomenology, namely that of the necessity of integrating and giving due place to the genetic and self-reflexive structure of knowledge within the non-material part of phenomenological transcendental logic. In order to clarify what underlies the idea of comprehension in phenomenology. That's the first result. And the other one is that it gives rise to the elaboration of a phenomenology of inappearance, which of non-appearing, which presents itself as a speculative phenomenology of inappearance, non-appearing, or of inconspicuous. Two seemingly oxymoronic characterizations which rather testify to the complexity of transcendental phenomenology. For the ontological part, only very, very briefly sketched for lack of time, I allow myself to refer once again to Seinsschwingung, Le Clignotement de l'être, which developed the question of the relation between reflection and reality. And I will end now to say in a more general way what justifies all the same my reservations towards a realist phenomenology and what calls in my eyes for a renewal of a transcendental phenomenology. By doing so, I may not do justice to all realist phenomenologists, who may not all recognize themselves in it. But I will make clear, I hope, how I understand the realism from which I would like to distance myself. These reservations are of an epistemological, ethical, and aesthetic order. I will be very brief. First of all, realism gives itself what it is, first of all, a question of clarifying and justifying. Correlation, for example, is no more for it an unquestionable datum than the being in itself of reality. The same is true also for sense and reflection. Realism asserts the inanity of even asking this question. And this seems to me to be clearly too short-sighted. Secondly, to assert dogmatically the es ist so, it is like that, of a reality given in advance poses also an ethical problem to me. From the conception of such a given in advance of the being or of the real, it is just one step towards the obligation to accept all that goes with it, namely the real with respect to its order, its institutions, its encrusted structures, its inertia. The contestation of an uncritically posed real is at the same time an ethical and moral call. And it is not from any assumed philosophical position that it would be a question of giving a moral lesson. I anticipate the reproaches on this point, but on the contrary, it must be the ethical posture that commands our philosophical choices. Finally, thirdly, I also have reservations of an aesthetic nature, but they are inseparable from the ethical aspect. What disturbs me in the realist position, at least when it is posed as a whole, is a certain lack of sensitivity towards doubt, flaws, gaps, abysses. I think that if phenomenology has something to do with Descartes' thought, it is not so much because of the fact that one has to look for a fundamentum in concussum, as Heidegger says, but because the genius malignus remains everywhere a real threat. And in my view, I say this half humorously, but really no more than half, realism simply lacks the poetry in all senses of the word, and the love for fiction to assume such a position. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schnell, for this very excellent, very inspiring lecture. Now I think we can immediately open the discussion session, okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Any questions?
Hello, Professor, could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have two questions, and I think they have some relations. And the first one concerns about the main point of your lecture, beneath appearing. That is, what I want to know is the exact difference between appearing and the inappearing, or between the phenomenon and the pre-phenomenon. If here beneath means some kind of transcendental condition, then what kind of transcendental? And also,
sorry, there's an interruption. I cannot hear you.
If here beneath means some transcendental condition, then what kind of transcendental? And I'm also confused about the pre-phenomenal field. We have seen that you have found in this realm, such as the fundamental concepts and their correlations. Are they themselves phenomenon, or just a phenomenon with some transcendental function? And what makes these concepts pre-phenomenon and the other concepts are not? Will this raise another question? What is pre-phenomenon? This is the first one. And the second one concerning the third operation.
Maybe you can first answer the first question.
I'm sorry, it was constantly interrupted. I just heard the part of the question is correlation and sense and reflection itself phenomenon, right?
Right.
But you were
talking. What makes them pre-phenomenon and other concepts are not?
Okay, yes.
And
thank you.
Will this raise another question that is there something that determines something is pre-phenomenon, which means there should be something pre-phenomenon?
Okay, very good questions. Thank you.
Next one.
Why do you think that there should be
frozen? Hello. 给他打一个字。就写 You are frozen。
已经出现掉了。
对，在线的问题。咱们会议室还有位置，有位置，对。出现，要重新登录一下。你刚才一直都很好。
对，刚才一直，你这边应该是有问题。
联系他也只是那个，如果他网络有问题，邮件也会有问题，对吧？所以就没有别的办法。
地方可以上来了。
只能是他那边输入会议号来操作，咱们这边没法直接去邀请。
OK。大家稍微等一下，我估计他那边掉线得重新登录一下。看来无语的问题太重磅了，一下把它炸出去。
然后
第三个。
Can you hear me?
Yes, pretty well.
I'm really sorry. My computer doesn't work anymore, so now I'm linked by my mobile phone.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry. I don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I just heard one question right now, and the question was why the three fundamental concepts of phenomenology are whether they are phenomenons or not. What is the sense of this pre-phenomenality of these concepts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you ask something that there is a second layer, kind of pre-phenomenality, right?
Yeah.
And why are you talking about this? Why do you think that it's at stake here?
Because I'm not clear that the distinction between phenomenon and pre-phenomenon is determined by their transcendental functions. But what determines these transcendental functions to these concepts? Is there any other conditions?
Okay, thank you. Good. Yeah. Actually, there are several points here. I have to develop this a little bit longer. First, the problem is that the most interesting problems in phenomenology open up when we get to the limits of the phenomenological sphere, which is determined by description and evidence, by description and intuition. As you know, Husserl defined the principle of all principles by, according to evidence and intuition, the virtue of legitimating knowledge. We have no knowledge in phenomenology if there is no evidence or no intuition. That's the principle of all principles. But the interesting point is that the most interesting problems open up when we get to the limits of evidence. For instance, if you look at the texts on time constitution, Husserl understands that if we want to explain how the phenomenological means of constitution are themselves constituted, we don't have any intuition or any evidence to give account for it. And that's why Husserl himself gets to that what he calls the preimmanence or the pre-phenomenality. And the question is, how can we go further here? If we have no intuition and no possible description anymore, how can we proceed? And I did develop this point, but it's very important. It was not Husserl, but Fink who gave an answer to this problem. And the answer is in the 6th Cartesian meditation, and is called constructive phenomenology. We can go beyond the limits of description and evidence by proceeding to phenomenological constructions. But the phenomenological construction is not just a construction by concepts, or if you want, speculative construction, as it was in metaphysics before phenomenology. But the phenomenological construction is the way of giving account to constitution in a kind of zigzag movement between that what we have to constitute and the construction itself. And my purpose here was to say that this method, this way of constructing, is methodologically structured, and that's what I call the transcendental structures of pre-phenomenality. Whenever I'm talking about pre-phenomenality or pre-immanence, I mean the fact that we go further, that we go beyond the limits of phenomenological sphere, of phenomenological description. And there are different methods, different kinds of constitutions in the sphere beyond the phenomenological sphere, or in the sphere I call pre-phenomenal or pre-immanent sphere. Different methods or different kind of phenomenological constructions. And when it was questioned about the syntheses, the three kinds of syntheses in the preeminent sphere, it was another word or another way of explaining these three kinds of phenomenological constructions. And the second very important point is that actually the fundamental concepts of phenomenology, or the fundamental syntheses, the three kinds of syntheses, they give themselves when we are reflecting on the way these different kind of phenomenological construction can be realized. It is a little bit like in transcendental philosophy in Kant. Kant was asked, but your categories, where are they coming from? How do you get these categories? Of course, we have a leading principle by the forms of judgment, etc. But actually, he said, if we deal with this matter, we will encounter them. And it's a little bit the same thing here. Husserl himself, he said, he gave us informations about the way he conceived of method and phenomenology. And I pointed to the very important paragraphs in Crisis and in Ideen 1, the most important texts of Husserl, where actually he explains what is the function of correlation, of sense, and of reflection. But as I said, he doesn't go further in this reflection. And the main point of this perspective beneath appearing is that the possibility to give a content to the methodological principles of phenomenology, of transcendental phenomenology, we have to follow, so to say, the reflexive the process of self-reflexivity. This is a process of self-reflexivity, a little bit like in Hegel's logic, the categories are given by the self-movement of the idea itself, and there is a similar processuality in phenomenology also, and the aim here is to make this a phenomenon in phenomenology, because up to here, people say, yeah, we have phenomenology, it's a descriptive discipline, and then we have metaphysics, and they are proceeding by concepts and by pure rationality, etc. But the reason why I pointed out the second way of accessing to the beneath of appearing, and namely by thematizing the transcendental logic, the sense of it was to say, we have a place, we have an architectonic place in phenomenology for this process of self-reflexivity, which gives account for the content of phenomenological methods. I don't know if it's clear what I said, but that's my answer right now.
Yeah.
Shall I make some correction? If not misunderstanding, I think that the transcendental, in your sense, is a phenomenological methodology, and I can understand the reflection and the correlation as a method, but I can't well understand that in what sense that sense is also a method, and okay. According to Merleau-Ponty, sense itself is instituted. It is. I can't understand why it is a method.
Okay, thank you. I understand. Yeah, why sense does it belong to the problem of methodology in phenomenology? Why sense is included here? Because of the fact that in phenomenology we don't deal with the real world, with the real objects of the world. Yeah, by starting phenomenology, by opening the phenomenological field thanks to epoche and reduction, the real world is put into brackets, and we are dealing with phenomenality. And the main point here is, and Husserl says it very clearly in Ideas 1, the point is that the objects we are dealing with in phenomenology are not real objects, but sense, Sinneinheit, unities of sense. And maybe you are right to say, but we cannot mix up sense like Merleau-Ponty is dealing with, and we should maybe find another word here to distinguish the fact that in phenomenology we deal with sense unities and not with real objects. But the fact is simply that Husserl himself is talking about sense in this context, and that's why I use the same word.
The second question.
The phenomenon here I'm talking about when it's question about sense is that that this concept gives us indications about how we have to understand the ontological status of the phenomena.
The second question concerning the third operative sentences that help us descending into the beneath appearing. It is interesting you call that it is a generative sentences, but I can't figure out how it operates. It seems to start from certain original facts, and the fifth fact seems more important, namely the fact of appearing itself. It seems to lead us to the pre-phenomenal sphere, but how does this transformation from facts to the pre-phenomenal sphere?
Yeah, the problem I could answer by putting the question in a different way. The question is, how do we have access to the reality, to the objects, without merely presupposing given reality? That is the fundamental question of transcendental phenomenology against realistic phenomenology. And at the end, we can answer this question only if we are able to account for the reflexive dimension of reality. This is a thesis that we find already in Hegel and in Fichte, and it is true also for phenomenology. But we cannot proceed in the same way like in German idealism. We have to establish the bridge, if you want, the bridge between epoche and the new world opened by epoche, and then the deepening of the transcendental sphere in pre-phenomenal or pre-immanent sphere. And how does it operate? Your question was how does it operate precisely? How can we understand the third synthesis? And the answer is there is, in contrary to the German idealistic perspective, there is no universal method here. We have not a given method once for all, for every time and everything, but in any phenomenological case, these methods operate in a different way. And I gave you just a first example concerning the question of the self-legitimation of not of knowledge, but of making comprehensible or understanding what's at stake. And as it has to be developed furthermore, it's clear, but it was a first draft, if you want.
Other questions?
But thank you very much for your good questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have any questions? If they don't have questions, I actually have a couple of questions. You can hear me,
Go
right?
on. Yes,
Yeah.
very good.
I appreciate you stress this theoretical stake in phenomenology. I think it's very important. And this is also connected to your idea of transcendental philosophy as such, maybe from Kant, Fichte, Husserl. I think here you stresses the Kantian critique aspect in this transcendental thinking, namely try to reflect on the subjectivity, this side. But the problem is, you understand there's a lot of controversy with respect to the notion of transcendental in the last century, like Neo-Kantian and also the other, the philosophical schools. So I'm just wondering whether we could just stress this subjective aspect without at the same time taking into account the objective side, and then to show this is a kind of transcendental. Because here, it's just remind me, especially your title, remind me something like the later Merleau-Ponty will criticize the kind of direct access to this ontology, phenomenological ontology. It will show a kind of indirect way, right? Namely, we always need a kind of detour rather than direct induction, as you said, induction to this transcendental condition itself. And you also acknowledge the transcendental means making the transcendental itself explicit, right? So in this sense, I'm just wondering whether we could separate, as you said, very clearly separate these two things and just to focus on the subjective side. So this is my first question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very good question also. Yeah, actually, I was talking almost 1 hour, and yeah, I was talking about one aspect, and of course, we should talk about the other aspect, about the ontological aspect too. And the two books in which I developed these perspectives, Seinsschwingungen, Wirklichkeitsbilder und Seinsschwingungen, or La décence du sens et le clignotement de l'être, they develop these two aspects. The first one is the transcendental aspect. The second one is the ontological aspect within the perspective of transcendental phenomenology. So, yeah, maybe I have said we have to separate them, but the fundamental idea is not to separate them. But the fundamental idea is to try to understand, and I admit that I'm certainly not at the end of this way, but I try to understand how we can consider both the perspectives of epistemological and ontological phenomenology together. That's the question, and there are many, or not many, but some answers to this question. I must admit that according to me, phenomenologists don't ask this question quite enough. We should ask this question much more often, because either phenomenologists consider that in the perspective of phenomenology, we are already in an ontological perspective. It's, for instance, the way Heideggerians consider this topic, and a lot of realist phenomenologists also. But if we take seriously the way Husserl opened phenomenology, and especially after the transcendental turn, we cannot say we by the transcendental method in phenomenology, we at the beginning are also in the field of an ontological perspective, because it cannot fit together with the methodological steps at the beginning. Husserl is talking about putting into brackets the position of being. If the position of being, if being is put into bracket, that means that we cannot start from an ontological perspective. So either phenomenologists consider we already are in an ontological perspective, but it's not conciliable with transcendental perspective, or they consider that they are transcendentalists, but then we have a lot of difficulties to understand how we get to the being. And that's and I don't want to give up the transcendental perspective. I don't want to give up the position Husserl held till the end of his philosophical life, and then the difficulty is how to link this perspective with an ontological perspective. So my purpose is not to say we have to separate these two perspectives, but we have to understand how these two perspectives go together. And my talk was far too short to give an account about the second part, about the ontological perspective. We should need another conference to deepen this point.
Yeah, thank you. My second question, because you acknowledge this, especially stress the principle in eating eyes, namely this intuition evidence, and you use this to define the nature of phenomenology. So here, because we want to have the phenomenological description of the immanent side of subjectivity, and then we need to ground our description on the basis of this principle, namely intuition evidence. And in this way, you show there's a kind of pre-immanent or the pre-phenomenality in this transcendental condition itself. And then the question is, in this way, if you have this very the strict boundary of this phenomenality, I'm just wondering.
Sorry, the strict what?
The bound of this phenomenality, yes. The limit yes. of this phenomenality, and then to what extent we can still say this understanding of this phenomenological construction, as you said, still yes. belongs to phenomenology, or whether it is still already go beyond phenomenology itself.
Yes, so thank you. It's all a question of how you define phenomenology. If you yeah. consider that if we are getting to the boundary of phenomenology, and we cannot deal with these boundaries, and which is beyond these boundaries, I agree with you. Okay, we go out of phenomenology, and it's something different of phenomenology. But if, on the contrary, you consider it's, and that's why I was talking several times about making this or that a genuine phenomenological phenomenon. If you consider that these reflections also belong to a possible treatment in the frames and in the limits of phenomenology, why not consider to go beyond that what classically is called phenomenology? Husserl himself talks about Grenzprobleme der Phänomenologie, boundary of, or the problems of frontiers, of boundaries, of limits of phenomenology. In my opinion, phenomenological method does not restrict itself or limit itself only to immanent descriptions, but all the pertinent and relevant problems of phenomenology and of explaining of sense also belong to phenomenology, and that's why I propose the extension of phenomenological method beyond epoche, reduction, etc. And that's the reason why I introduce other description, and that's why I'm introducing other concepts like hypophysical epoche, like induction, and like construction, because I think that it's absolutely legitimated to include these perspectives of going beyond these boundaries within phenomenological frame.
Yeah, I understand, but just quickly following your suggestion, because if we think about this, try to enlarge or extend this boundary of phenomenology, but then what would be the form of consciousness which is involved in phenomenological reflection? Because the phenomenological knowledge must be made or observed by way of this reflection, phenomenological reflection. But then what kind of consciousness which would constitute this reflection, right?
Yeah. Yeah, very good question also. The first thing is that we have to take seriously all the attempts that try to say the phenomenological constitution does not concern only transcendental ego. Yeah, there is phenomenological constitution thanks to a field we can call the pre-subjective or asubjective field. The members of the third generation of phenomenologists, after the generation after Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Lévinas, etc., people like Marc Richir, for instance, they do not consider at all anymore transcendental ego as the starting point of phenomenological analysis and above all of phenomenological constitution. There is one of this question of limits of boundaries of phenomenology concerns the passage from subjective, egological to asubjective phenomenology. So the point I propose is to say, okay, let's understand what it means, a subjective field, a subjective phenomenological field. What is the content? What is in it? And that's what I developed today. Your question, but how this pre-phenomenal dimension has itself a constitutive function. Yeah, that's a kind of task we have to think over further. It's not, I didn't answer to this question yet. I agree with this.
Yeah, thank you. And my final question, I'm sorry for this, because your lecture really inspired me to think a lot about the phenomenological, especially current phenomenological situation. Because the third one, my final one, also connected to the second one. Because when you use Algonfink to talk about this kind of the process, self-reflective process, and yes. Algonfink says this is the kind of transcendental happening. Yes. And then the problem for Algonfink is always who is actually watching this transcendental happening, namely phenomenologische Zuschauer, phenomenological observer.
Yes.
But then here, because the Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and also the other phenomenologists, the suggestion remind me whether we should understand this phenomenologist itself as beyond the world, or rather we should think about the phenomenologist as its own stance still in the world.
Yeah. It's very pleasant to discuss with you. So first, concerning the phenomenological Zuschauer, spectator, he was implicit in what I was developing. He was always present. He assisted to all this. It was developed from the standpoint of the phenomenological spectator. I didn't put it explicitly, but it was implicitly involved in all this. And it's absolutely right that it's absolutely true that Fink himself always asked himself, but what is the link between this we are dealing with in phenomenology and the world? Is there a gap between natural attitude and phenomenological or transcendental attitude or not? And that's one of my that's one of the deepest questions I'm always thinking about. And that was a little bit also the topic of my very last reflections about the aesthetic and the epistemological dimension of realism and idealism in phenomenology. I think that indeed there is something like a danger maybe to drift to a kind of Richer called this fictive metaphysics. That if you take seriously epoche and all that I was developing about the imaginal dimension of legitimation of knowledge, if the notion of image, of Bild and Einbildungskraft, imagination is so important in transcendental phenomenology, if we take all this seriously, the question is philosophy something near to poetry, or or not. At the beginning, I said, if we are dealing with sense, that's why we really are not on the same level than, for instance, physics. Physics are talking about the empirical world. Transcendental phenomenology does not talk in the same way of empirical world, but of the sense of the world. And sense is in a certain sense situated on a deeper level than empiric reality. And but on the other hand, and you are totally right by asking this, what is the sense of transcendental phenomenology if we do not have any link with real world? It has to have a link, otherwise it doesn't help for nothing. And I don't say that there's no link. I just say that they are talking about the same world, but on different levels. And the level of phenomenology is the level of the way sense is emerging. Or to put it in Fink's words, the question is how the world is born. It's the question of the birth of the world, and not of the description of innerweltliche Phänomene, of phenomena that are within the world. And that's a completely different perspective.
Thank you. Maybe let me see whether the audience had some questions, okay?
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah, answer please.
I have a
Yeah.
question. Maybe this is kind of naive, but I have a couple of naive questions. One of them is at the end, and I think at some other places in the text, I think you were criticizing realism. I guess yes. I'm wondering who the target is and what realism means. And is it just realist phenomenologists, or are you targeting realists overall? So this is partly a question that is brought out also so your first point in the last paragraph, you say yes. Correlation, for example, is no more for it an unquestionable datum than the being in itself of reality. That seems to me to imply that you think that realists think that things like correlations and being in itself are not unquestionable, so are questionable. But I mean, maybe realist phenomenologists think that, or some of them. But I know, so one can have a realism and think that it's just not questionable that there is a being in itself. You see something, you see a chair, and by seeing a chair, it's not questionable that there is a chair, and that might be a realist position. So I guess the first question is, what do you mean by realism? Is this just an in-house phenomenological debate, or is this that you're engaging with, or are you dealing with realists of various stripes and other types of realists?
Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm. It's of course a very fundamental question. The naive questions are the most fundamental, but it's not naive at all. On the other hand, yeah, I don't want to drop names. I just want to point something that is, in my eyes, absolutely fundamental. And of course, you're right. There is a chair, and we won't doubt about the fact that there is a chair. But the question is, what does it mean? There is a chair, and the realistic position is to say there is a chair, and if I notice the chair or not, it doesn't change anything. And the fact that I have a relation to the chair by perceiving it or by thinking it doesn't change nothing neither. And I just want to say, but how is it possible? The first question is, how is it possible to say there is a chair? Yeah. How is it possible to identify a chair as chair? How is it possible to give a sense to this chair? And Husserl's point is to say we have to bracket all kind of metaphysical presuppositions. And one of the most, one of the strongest presupposition is to say there is already a given world and everything is positively given, and we are just transparent spectators of this world, but doesn't change anything to the world. If this is a presupposition, the question is what kind of relation we can have to things, to objects, to the world, without considering any kind of presuppositions. And I think actually the answer phenomenologists give to this question is to say the first thing is there is not a thing in itself, but there is a relation to the thing. There is an intentional act. There is an intentional relation between something and something, between something that is given and something that understands something, or that gives sense to this. And that's in a certain sense an anti-realistic position. The realistic position does not begin by or start by a relation, but by the things themselves. And what do you think about this? Is for you, is it another kind of presupposition to say we are starting by relation and not by the thing? The easy answer first from the standpoint of the phenomenologists to say, but how do you know that there is a thing? How do you can say anything about the thing, about think about it, etc., if you are not involved in this appearing of the thing? Yeah, what do you say about this? What do you think about this?
Well, okay, yeah, so you asked me about whether taking there to be a relation might be another presupposition, and I guess if Husserl thinks that something like taking the chair to be an existing thing in a pre-given world, if that's something that he takes to be a metaphysical presupposition, and I don't see how one can say that. So something like there being a relation wouldn't be a relation, maybe with non-existent objects or whatever, and that possible non-existence of what we're seeing. That is not also a kind of bringing in metaphysical machinery about. So that was your question to me, and I think. It sounds to me like that, saying that there's like a relation there, and then starting to flesh out what that relation is, seems to be something like a metaphysical activity, and potentially also just like the first one, the givenness of the world, to be a potential presupposition, metaphysical presupposition. If you think that that's something you can draw from it. So, I mean, I have always wondered why someone like Husserl has thought that something, I guess from a realist perspective, why something like the givenness of the world or the givenness of the chair is a metaphysical presupposition. Like what that kind of means. One might just take that to be the given and the default, and then doubt comes potentially after, and doubt is a kind of metaphysical activity. But accepting that there is such a thing as the chair when you see it, because you can speak English, for instance, and do the same in German, that is like the given level. And then doubt might come later because you think, oh, maybe the lighting was dodgy or things like that. And then you can bring in Cartesian doubt. So I guess, yeah, so I think I answered your first question, your question to me about the relation being a potential presupposition. It seems to me like if you give the givenness to be a presupposition, this seems to be even more metaphysical. And then I guess my follow-up question is, I've always wondered why Husserl and maybe some phenomenologists following him would take something like the given to be a metaphysical presupposition and not the thing that comes before you bring in doubt later.
Yeah, it's quite linked with the first one. Yeah, if I understand well. Yeah, I would say, yeah, there are several very interesting points in what you say, but I would say that the first thing is, yeah, I assume perfectly that it's a metaphysical position, and if we are talking about these things, there is no other way than starting by metaphysical reflections. If we reject this kind of perspective, I would say, okay, you can say it's not very interesting for me to ask if the thing is something given in relation or if it's given by himself. I don't care. I want to talk about things and not about this metaphysical consideration about it. I would answer, yeah, but for me, it's the contrary. I'm interested above all in the question, what is the possibility to get in contact with the world in the first place, and what is implicitly considered in this, and what do we have to make explicit? And maybe another way to put this is to say, probably, and it's the same thing in ethics, yeah, the Kantian perspective that there has to be one moral law and one possibility to consider moral or ethical behavior. I think it's a weak perspective, because human beings are different, and they have different constitutions or presuppositions, and we cannot consider all this in the same way for everybody in the same way. And it's maybe the same thing in metaphysics also. There are maybe several kind of fundamental positions, and there's a very interesting idea of Fichte, who says the philosophy we are choosing, it depends on the human, on what kind of human being we are. And maybe indeed I am maybe skeptical, and other people are less skeptical. They don't think that it's a problem to ask if how a real world is given, and how it does appear in the first place, etc. Yeah, maybe there are different fundamental ways of being open to the world that leads to the consequence that we are starting philosophy by different ways. For me, the question, for me, the fact that we can be wrong is not a kind of contingency, but it's fundamental. And I feel very close to Descartes when he begins philosophy by the doubt, the hyperbolical doubt, and also the construction of a genius malignus, of a bad god who can maybe be the beginning of a completely illusion of everything. I feel very near to this kind of way to start reflection and thinking. I can fully understand that other people say, yeah, for me it's not understandable. People like Leibniz and Spinoza, a few years after Descartes, they said this cogito thing is completely senseless. But yeah, for them maybe it's senseless, but many people don't think that it's senseless. So yeah, maybe you're right, or I don't know if you wanted to say that, but I can understand if somebody says you are against realism and you defend transcendentalism, but it's a way of thinking that the realists are wrong and you are right. But actually, I don't think that. I don't want to say there is a good philosophy, transcendentalism, and there is a bad philosophy, realism. Maybe it sounds sometimes like this, but deeply, I don't want to say that. I just want to say, for me, for my kind of ontological constitution, I am more convinced of transcendental perspective than realistic, and I know that I'm quite in the minority in general.
Yeah, okay, so thanks for all the answers. I have a follow-up question, sort of in the same direction. So I was thinking, if you're interested, if you do not adopt this realist position, but the transcendental one, and you're interested in, let's say, how in this position objects are constituted, I was thinking, in many cases, adopting a realist position helps us to understand why we perceive things the way we perceive them. So I might have a view of the world as being objective in a certain sense and have a certain theory about light reflecting from those objects and coming to my retina and so on and so forth. And that might inform a theory that tells me why objects in our cognitive apparatus are constituted the way they're constituted. It kind of seems that if I bracket all that information that I have gathered from my, let's say, physics theory, then I'm also bracketing a lot of information that might ideally help me in formulating nice theories about how, let's say, perception is constituted, how conscious thought is constituted, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So the question in the end is, doesn't this bracketing also bracket useful information for your own project?
Yeah, that's the question. There are two theories. The first one is yours, for instance. If you are bracketing everything positive sciences, information that positive sciences give us about the world, if we are bracketing this, then we will also lose too many important things to understand the fundamental question of original contact with the world, etc. That's one theory. And there's another one that says we have two different dimensions here, two different layers or two different spheres. On the one hand, we have the sphere of the given world of all particular sciences are studying and observing, etc. And in this sphere, everybody is realist, of course. Everybody. It has no sense to be idealist in this sense. But the question is, if we are considering the metaphysical questions, is it also true that we need the information of positive sciences to say something about the metaphysical truth? And I would say no, and I'm of course not the only one. Even Aristotle considers that physics and metaphysics doesn't belong to the same discipline. But I understand your position. I think, yeah, why should we why should we complicate ourselves the task, and why don't we consider only one regime or one dimension of reality? But not the fact, but the interesting thing is that it could be that this position is not the only one, and not maybe the most interesting one.
May I just
for instance, just to say one more word about this.
Yeah.
All the discussion between Fichte and Schelling was exactly about this point. Schelling said it has no sense to consider. No, he said we have to consider what physics are teaching us in order to understand well idealism. And Fichte answers, you didn't understand what idealism is. You cannot mix up realism and idealism. And idealism has his own force and position. And yeah, it's exactly the same opposition.
Yeah, may I just quickly follow up? Because in your lecture, you never mentioned the term idealism at all. You always say transcendental philosophy, from Kant, Fichte to Husserl. But in this discussion, idealism is very interesting. Show up. So I'm just wondering, in your own phenomenological development, especially as you said, you want to go back to the ars sujet, right? So towards the subjectivity, to this transcendental condition. And also you said, in this realm, we could find, like, the metaphysical, the facticity, as Teng Duyi said, and then all these terms like the word, the I, the intersubjectivity, and also history, all these things just like the reality, right? So in this sense,
sorry, all these things?
All these things just sounds like realities, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
This is the word. And then in this sense, do you want to develop a kind of transcendental realism, or you want to have a transcendental idealism, as what Husserl has in mind?
Yeah, thank you very much. You're absolutely right. You noticed well the nuance. For years, I always defended transcendental idealism against realism. And at the end, we are only talking about, is realism right or idealism? And that's why I decided not to mention idealism anymore, in order not to get into this kind of discussion. Nevertheless, we always get in this same kind of discussions. Yeah, I think that it's important to get back to what the person before you said about the fact that, of course, we learn a lot of things about the real positive world thanks to perception and thanks to realistic positions, etc. And in no way I consider that we can put this into question. But yeah, I think indeed that the interesting perspective in phenomenology, as I said later on, the interesting thing is that the Grenzprobleme, the boundary problems or the boundary problems lead us to a kind of philosophy which is in a certain way beneath the problematic of idealism and realism. And that's why I used the term, which I think is quite appropriate, of asubjective phenomenology. And the asubjective phenomenology is neither only merely idealistic nor merely realistic. But if I had to choose at the end, yes, I'm idealistic phenomenologist and not realistic.
Okay, yeah, probably we have to close our discussion because the time has already run out.
Okay, I think we have a very interesting, discussion, and also from this lecture, we appreciate this battlefield of transcendental philosophy, the philosophy of idealism or realism. I think that's leave us many interesting thinking afterwards. So once again, let's thank Professor Alexander Schnell for this excellent lecture, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated all this. For me, it's the morning, not the afternoon. And yeah, let's continue this discussion. It was really a big pleasure for me.
Yeah, definitely. We hope to have you in person on campus, either next year or the year after next year. Yeah, after this removal of the pandemic restriction.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take
Goodbye.
care. Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.